Hey guys, just wanted to apologize if this latest video seems a bit ranty and disjointed. Anyway, before we get this show on the road, I try to avoid massive spoilers, but I will be talking about the following. R.A. Salvatore books, Halo, The Dark Crystal, The Legend of Zelda, The Lord of the Rings, and also by extension everything else set in Middle-earth, Avatar, The Last Airbender. Okay, goodbye, enjoy the video! In June of 2020, Wizards of the Coast announced that they were getting rid of the concept of alignment or certain cultural traits being tied to race. By November of 2020 and the release of Tasha's Cauldron and subsequent Unearthed Arcana, we saw this materialize with racial abilities from here on out only being tied to physical or magical characteristics. And, oh boy, a lot of the takes I've seen regarding that announcement were dumb as hell. And I mean, holy shit, they were really dumb. Here we go.
I like having the option of simplified conflict of good versus evil, just like we have simplified AC, HP, ability scores, and so on.
Some players will want to talk their way out of every situation. You can only dissuade them by saying that the creatures they're dealing with are not people, but inherently evil monsters.
I don't think there's an issue with having an always evil society,
So, how the fuck are you supposed to do a game built entirely around combat if there aren't just bad people to hit?
And then when someone points out that the changes made don't take out evil people entirely, they get this.
Like, having things always be evil takes out a lot of morality-induced headaches. Yeah.
And perhaps the worst take I've seen on the subject, like ever, albeit several years before this announcement. Chivington might have been quoted as saying, "Nits make lice," but he is certainly not the first one to make such an observation, as it is an observable fact. And for context, this is the full Chivington quote.
Like, damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Like, kill all and scalp all, big and little. Yeah, nits make lice.
So that was Gary Gygax's take. Yeah, fuck you, Gary, 1,000 orc babies upon your house. If this is your view on the subject, your takes are bad, and you should feel bad. First of all, if you're afraid of your players trying to talk their way out of every situation, maybe D&D isn't the system you want. There are all sorts of RPGs that are better for social intrigue-focused campaigns. World of Darkness immediately comes to mind. And not every DM and every campaign is going to be perfect for every player. Second, it's not as if this hasn't been done before. It's not like there was a highly successful campaign setting that debuted in the 3.5 era that showed us you could toss out well-known racial tropes entirely and still have a perfectly viable place for pretendy fun times. I mean, who the fuck is Keith Baker anyway? And third, if you really think there's nothing to kill for XP anymore now that humanoids aren't easily categorized into evil races and not evil races, then, If you don't believe it's possible to have conflict without falling into the same old tropes, you're either a lazy writer or you're making this argument in bad faith. Okay, look, I am not going to get super into the story and lore of Halo. This has not become a Halo channel, but can we just talk about Halo for 1 minute? The Covenant was a super interesting faction because they weren't inherently evil, and they had what they thought were noble intentions for what they did. Their leadership had fleshed out religious and political motivations that were expanded upon with a surprising amount of detail. And also, the humans were also assholes despite still being understandably upset about the aliens pew-pewing them to death. Both sides had clear motivations that were also at complete odds with each other, and once you add in a gross mutant fungus hive mind corrupting everything it can get its body horror flesh fingies on, things get even more complicated. But if you're just here for a rooty-tooty point-and-shooty about a space marine killing aliens, I mean, that's still there too. You can have big bad evil guys without descending into weird fantasy racism with unfortunate implications. You can have entire villainous factions. Hell, every culture on the planet has normalized some kind of horrible bullshit, so you still have a lot of leeway here. What you can't do is adopt some stupid black and white view of the world. You can't just be like, here's some orcs, get 'em, boyos. And when you need a reason why, you're like, because orcs are evil, boyos. Because black and white morality is always unhealthy and is always gonna start unraveling whenever someone pulls the sweater even a little bit. Look, you don't need to make sure you have every justification in the world so that your players don't feel bad about killing a guy. 9 times out of 10, they're gonna kill the guy anyway. So just laugh and acknowledge that your PCs are probably a bunch of dicks. All you really need in order to avoid some really gross implications are 1. A basic understanding of how people actually work, and 2. Nuance. And I know nuance is hard to do on the internet these days, but I'm gonna try. Part of the problem is because a lot of people simply aren't aware of how shitty their takes are when examined under a microscope. And I'm sorry, but that's a you problem. Another issue is that fantasy as a genre is pretty derivative, and by derivative, I mean specifically derivative off of one dude, and that dude is Tolkien. But here's the thing. Yes, orcs were an evil race in Tolkien's works. Yes, Tolkien was a stuffy white dude, and he specifically quoted the orcs as looking like the least lovely of the mongoloid types. And yeah, that's a bad take if I've ever seen one. But they weren't a naturally occurring race so much as they were corrupted people from races that already existed. So that's like one thing to Tolkien's credit. And later in his life, Tolkien was all, wait, oh shit, over the fact that he made all the orcs evil, but he died before he could write anything else. You see, Tolkien was Catholic, and Catholicism has a lot of takes on inherent evil. Specifically, that other than original sin, people just aren't born with that sort of thing in their hearts. That evil boils down to the choices you make. And I think even if you aren't Christian, most people will agree that the idea of inherent evil is kind of bullshit. So none of this really works, since the monstrous races in D&D are all naturally occurring, except whatever the fuck is going on with gnolls, I guess. I don't know, I just never use gnolls in my campaigns. They're weird and I don't like them. But goblins have goblin babies. Kobolds lay eggs. There's a really weird abundance of lore in D&D about how much orcs like to fuck. I'm sorry, but the nits make lights argument is bullshit. Let me tell you what happens to any paladin who even thinks about killing an orc baby on my watch.
I've fallen, and I can't get up.
Some of the stuff can get really dehumanizing. Like in Volo's Guide to Monsters, that's 2016, 5th edition, we get takes like orcs don't love their children, and orcs don't have romance and they see mating as a mundane necessity of life, and I'm sorry, but that just doesn't scan with how nature works. First of all, no one has sex because they see mating as a mundane necessity of life. I don't know how long you've been on this planet, but sex feels good to most people. Also, parents love their children, or at least it's accepted that they're supposed to. Sure, parents in more harsh environments might be more harsh when it comes to discipline, or they might let kids get a little hurt in the present under the pretense of preventing them from getting more hurt in the future. But even animals have an instinct to protect and nurture their offspring. And don't at me saying, oh, well, they just don't think like humans do. You don't understand. Unless you can just lay your eggs somewhere and have your offspring raise themselves, your species probably has the concept of love. Like, love is literally how a species survives. Just let me lay this out. Let's say you get pregnant, 9 months later you pop out a baby. If you don't love the baby, you have no real incentive to make sure it stays fed and kept safe from harm. If you don't love any of your family members, there's not a whole lot of incentive for loyalty to your clan. I guess you can make the argument that romance doesn't need to exist if lust does, but that's just weird. Like, I know you can fuck without caring about someone romantically, but you're telling me no one ever catches feelings? I'm not buying that. What's different among cultures is not whether or not these concepts exist. It's what norms are in place for how you go about reinforcing those bonds. In some cultures in real life, corporal punishment isn't seen as a big deal. trivial, while in other countries it's illegal. Maybe polygamy is accepted in one place, but not another, and so on. The biggest problem with tabletop RPGs is that a reasonable person out in the real world fucking knows the distinction between a direwolf and an orc. One of these is clearly a person, and the other is clearly not a person, but the devs would just have you believe that they're both bags of blood and XP, despite these two creatures being extremely different not only in social opportunities, but also combat tactics. The way fantasy RPGs like D&D and Pathfinder do stuff doesn't really take into account how actual cultures and world building work. So then you end up with a campaign setting that kind of tears at the seams whenever something unexpected happens or the players ask a question. And sure, some of y'all probably do just campaigns where you just kick in the door to the dungeon and you go all, I know you're in here, gelatinous cube Dracula, you fucking nerd, where's my money? But the majority of y'all probably have some semblance of a story in mind. And to get into the nitty-gritty, we're gonna need to start talking politics. And I know what you're saying, but you should never involve politics in your campaign. And sure, you probably want to avoid things that are one for one with current issues, but let's look at a few reasons why this line of thinking is bullshit. When you say that you don't want politics in your campaign, what you really mean is one of two things. The first possibility is just that you don't want to touch on stuff that's uncomfortably the same as current issues that are hanging over the heads of everyone at the table. And that's fair. This is why I more or less don't include homophobia or transphobia in any of my world building. I'm non-binary, I'm very much not straight, and most of my players are also part of the LGBTQ community. This is shit we all have to deal with in our real lives, and we play D&D to escape from that bullshit. That one RPG horror story about the DM who tried to get his players to storm the Capitol? Yeah, that's a yikes. Whatever issues do or don't come up at your table are going to depend on the comfort levels of you and your players, so some campaigns might be more comfortable with parallels to real-world issues while others might not. Just learn to read the room. However, I am going to say that certain genres and settings have more of a chance to get too real than others. If you want to avoid it, I would personally tell you to stay away from urban fantasy or cyberpunk campaigns. Unfortunately, some issues transcend time and space and are woven into the very fabric of every large-scale conflict we've got. War, corruption, incompetence, and greed are all around us, no matter when and no matter where we are. The second possibility is that you just don't want to think too hard about stuff, and sorry, but you're gonna have to get thinking. Because if your campaign has a king in it, it has politics. If it has any guards or other law enforcement in it, it has politics. If you have some sort of plot about overthrowing the Dark Lord, that's politics. If there's a war, there's politics. As long as there are at least 2 people left alive on Earth, there's going to be politics. And if your campaign has any people in it at all, any people ever, it has culture. Keith Amon, author of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, wrote that humanoids in tabletop RPGs fight for reasons related to the shit we don't talk about at dinner parties. Sex, religion, politics. And do you know why we typically don't bring up those things in polite company? Because they inevitably lead to arguments. You know, conflict. A lot of the problems come from conflating culture and race, or assuming that cultures are all a monolith. You know, like elves all do this, or orcs are savage brutes with a thirst for blood. Yes, different cultures are going to have different values and different practices, but that doesn't tell you the whole story, and neither does ignoring this reality entirely. Every single thought you have, unless that thought is something like, I'm hungry, or I'm horny, or I have to pee. Well, every thought you have is going to be based on your past experiences and knowledge, and a lot of that is culture. Here's one example. If you're American or have consumed a lot of American pop culture, you know what typical American breakfast foods are, quote unquote, supposed to look like. You've got bacon, eggs, oatmeal, etc. Alright, Americans, answer me this. What do you eat for breakfast? If you answered any of the typical American breakfast foods, it's because that's what you were taught was suitable for breakfast. If it's something else, you probably thought, I shouldn't be eating this at some point, or you just shrugged because it was tasty and breakfast rules are fake. Food is a really good example of cultural knowledge because a lot of this is stuff we learn from the day we start eating actual food. Like, I once met a kid who was utterly convinced that you put mayonnaise on a taco, and I'm not sure how to process that. I cannot stress this enough. Literally every decision decision a person makes is going to either be informed by the culture they were raised in, or there's some environmental factor superseding that. Even if it's subtle, they probably aren't going to live up to the ideal picture. But if they have something to gain from living up to their culture's ideals, they're going to seize on it and try to conform to those ideals the best they can. And if they have something to lose, or just plain don't like a thing, they're going to either reject the system entirely or find some way to slip under the radar or otherwise bend the rules. Unless a character is particularly self-aware or particularly selfless, it's likely that they're only going to care about whatever issues affect them or their loved ones. And it doesn't have to be wholesale. People are going to have some very nuanced ways they respond to their upbringing. And ironically, one of the best examples I've seen in D&D is from a campaign setting that I absolutely hate, the Forgotten Realms. I don't really like Drist because he's just like, I'm Drist, I'm the main character. But Jarlaxle is genuinely interesting. Without going into too many details, he's a male drow with fancy sword fighting and intrigue skills, and he's got way too many magic items, and he leads a group of other houseless male drow called Brigandartha, and I think they're mercenaries, but they do adventure shit on the surface. He's incredibly calculating and opportunistic because those are qualities that help someone survive in drow society. And he knows better than to trust anything that's given to him at face value because that's how people die in the Underdark. The very culture he's dissatisfied with gave him the tools he uses to get what he wants. He didn't abandon these aspects of his culture because no matter where he went, they could still benefit him. And yet, he dresses like this. Look at him. It's like someone ate the costuming department at a community theater and then stumbled out into a pride parade and then just started shitting and vomiting everywhere. When I played him as an NPC in Waterdeep Dragon Heist, he disguised himself as this guy. Yep. And where the standard operating procedure for most drow is subtlety and being goth as fuck, this guy always has to do things in the most batshit insane, flashy way possible. Drow culture places a huge amount of emphasis on long, silky hair as a sign of status and beauty, and Jarlaxle shaved his head. As a male in a fiercely matriarchal society, Jarlaxle's worth was predicated entirely on what powerful woman he could attach himself to. But he decided that was bullshit, so he rejected his culture's standards of fashion and personal grooming. And by fucking off to the surface to just do whatever the hell he wanted, he also rejected his culture's rules on how a proper gentleman ought to act. Jarlaxle is a man who's very informed by the culture he was raised in, both when he's benefiting from what it taught him and when he's actively giving the middle finger to it. And that's even without going into the fact that people are fundamentally people and they're going to interpret whatever values their culture has to their own ends. Like, I'm not going to get into any real world examples here, but really think about it. This is the source of a lot of political discourse out in real life. Just write characters who behave and react to things in the way that actual people would. It's not terribly hard, just sit back and do a few thought exercises whenever you make a new important NPC. And I promise you, the real reason the idea of an inherently evil race is fake, it's because evil is everywhere and you just have to feed it. And please, as an aside, please don't buy into the whole, well, they're evil because they worship an evil god mindset. People have done all sorts of horrifying shit in the name of religion in the real world. I could go all Megami Tensei right now and say that the Abrahamic god is evil because of that, and I'm not, because I know the can of worms that would open, and that's the logic we're operating on right now. Look, I'm probably going to do a video on this later, but the D&D gods are all assholes, even the ones you think are good. Don't go around telling me Corellon's a good guy. They're all assholes. You know how in Greek mythology, the gods just fuck around doing whatever, and any mortal who tries to assert themselves gets Zeus's lightning bolts up their asses? Yeah, the gods are just as messy and complicated as mortals, and it's about time we stop pretending that. But I'm going off topic. You don't need a genius to understand why people do horrible things. Just make a few well-developed assholes with reasonable motivations, and then fill your world with people who either stand to benefit from that dickery, or people who can't or don't want to do anything about it. People don't buy into fascism or other evil shit just because they wake up one day and decide it's a good idea. It comes from somewhere, and it's usually because the big bad evil guy is preying on ordinary people's short-sightedness and festering whatever prejudices they already have. And when you're surrounded by nothing but bullshit, you stop really caring enough to even try to discern truth from lies. You know what? Let's fucking go there. I'm gonna use some real world examples now. Ordinary people in Germany during the 30s and early 40s probably didn't question where their neighbors were being carried off to because it didn't affect them and it was better to keep your head down unless you wanted people knocking at your door. In 1800s America, white people danced around the issue of slavery forever until it hit a boiling point because they consider the economics more important than actual human lives being taken hostage. And besides, when people who are being taken hostage don't look like you, well, who gives a shit, right? And just under a couple months ago, also in the US, most of us were willing to brush off an attempted insurrection because we didn't take the insurrectionists seriously enough. All of these people were absolute fucking cowards, but the real horror was how commonplace it was. You don't need inherently evil races. You just need a big bad evil guy, and you need some higher ups in his chain of command who also stand to benefit from his scheme. Then you need some mooks who are on the BBEG's payroll and have families to feed and student loans to pay off or something, and who don't really want to be asking too many questions. Apathy is a hell of a drug sometimes. For the truly heinous shit, once the mooks are in as deep as the people they're taking orders from, and once they've dirtied their own hands, they usually have little choice but to keep going now that the BBEG has that dirt on them. Your boss tells you to yeet a baby once under pain of death, so you do it. But you can't unyeet the baby. So now that your hands are stained with baby blood, your boss asks you to yeet some more babies. But if you try to blow his cover, people are gonna ask how you know, and then you're the baby yeeter forevermore. Like I said, shit gets wild. Everyone else can just be a normal person and it works fine. It doesn't even have to be that nefarious. In Curse of Strahd, everyone knows that Strahd von Zarovich is an evil bastard, and maybe the Barovians aren't evil, but they're all either too apathetic or too beaten down to really do much about it, and anyone who tries just dies horribly. So do we just accept that explanation for Barovia because they're mostly humans, or at least quote not unquote non-evil races or some shit? I mean, this is also my take on how a lot of Drow society works. You can't really reasonably expect the houses that do all their plotting and scheming and bullshit to actually be the majority of Drow. Like, it's probably just the societal elites that do this, and the normal Drow are just like regular schlubs trying to survive. And I'm going off script here, but like, that's just how society works in D&D, like, normally. Like, yes, I just described something that's kind of horrible, but really, if you go on the surface, regular human pig farmers are just trying to survive while the nobles are also doing Game of Thrones plotting bullshit. Like, it's kind of wild that we actually have this double standard when it comes to fantasy races, but here we are, I guess. Actually, one of the few examples I've seen of a quote-unquote evil faction done well was the Fire Nation from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Sure, Ozai was evil, and so were his daughter and a good deal of the higher-ups in the Fire Nation military, but your everyday citizens and most of the rank-and-file mooks were just normal people. There wasn't even really this bullshit with Iroh or Zuko about them like, oh, trying to rise above their inherent Fire Nation-ness, because the writers knew that was bullshit. Anyway, everyone in the Fire Nation was informed by their culture to think of Aang a certain way, and everyone who tried helping Team Avatar did so at great personal risk, but like, they acted like actual people. Zuko aside though, let's stop talking about the heavy stuff for now and go more into the odds and ends of world building. All of the racial tropes in fantasy start breaking down when you ask one simple question. How does everyone get food? You need to explain this stuff. If dwarves are famous for their booze, where does the grain come from that they use to make the booze? Oh, there's an evil orc horde on the horizon? An army travels on its stomach, so how do they feed the hordes? I guess a small clan of elves living in the woods can support themselves themselves without having to do any agriculture. But for those fancy elf cities, they need farmers to support all those people. What do the goblins eat? Why are my questions about goblin gastronomy never answered? Make it make sense. Like in the Zelda games, I guess we can say that the Gorons are the equivalent to dwarves because they live in the mountains and they spend their days mining and they're famous for being skilled blacksmiths. But here's the thing, Gorons eat rocks. So we don't need to answer any questions about how they get food because they're in the mountains already where there's a lot of rocks. Unless your dwarves also eat rocks, which you can totally say they do, you're going to need to explain how they live in the mountains and dedicate most of their time to activities that don't produce food. Do they trade for the food? Who the fuck is making the trips up there? Or maybe there actually are dwarf farmers? Hey, this is actually a totally viable option. Say it with me. Dwarf farmers. It doesn't have to be a super duper detailed explanation, just one that answers the most obvious questions of long-term survival. To keep this real short, if you want to have large cities or other settlements, you probably need agriculture in order to sustain that many people staying in one place. Larger nomadic groups, like what most people do with orcs, are probably going to have some sort of livestock that they herd. This can be any kind of animals that make sense to you as long as they travel well and can be used for a few different purposes. They can then supplement the meat and milk from their livestock with food that they hunt, gather, or raid from other settlements if that's their thing. This is my biggest beef with the Dothraki in Game of Thrones. It's not really shown what livestock they care for besides the horses they ride, even though they were based on Mongolians. And yes, horses are a big deal to steppe nomads, but so are sheep, which they eat and milk and use for wool. Smaller clans, like say a druid circle, can just get by with hunting and gathering. Also take into account how developed a given culture's technology is going to be. And don't fall into the trap of assuming that a culture with less advancement in tech means that their people are stupid. Tabletop devs have a real bad track record of giving their monster races low intelligence because of that assumption. Even though it's assumed that your average peasant has average intelligence, and I don't think Jerry the pig farmer was formally educated either. This doesn't even make sense a lot of the time. Like, goblins and kobolds especially are said to use a lot of traps and do tinkering, and yet you want me to believe they're stupid? Do you think I'm stupid? Without going into too much detail, because I'm not an anthropologist, the cultures that have more development in technology typically have a few things in common. They have access to abundant crafting resources like metal, which they can use to make tools and nicer things. They have access to arable land. Remember when I said agriculture is necessary to support larger populations? That's partly because more production of food and other byproducts equals more production of other goods. They have access to animals that are easier to domesticate. There's a reason we milk cows but not giraffes or bears. They're close enough to other societies to establish potentially friendly relations. This opens the door for trade and cultural exchange of ideas. If a culture is isolated for too long, it begins to stagnate. All of this really depends on you being born in the right place at the right time. It's sheer dumb luck of the draw. As an aside, a culture with more inventory to keep track of is going to have more of a use for writing, so don't be surprised if a culture mostly transmits information orally. Hell, if we're being realistic, Jerry the human pig farmer probably couldn't read himself. How technically developed a culture is has nothing to do with morality or intelligence, and everything to do with wealth and proximity to more inspo. People aren't stupid if all they have is stone tools and a goat. It takes a lot of intelligence to figure out how to make stone tools from nothing, and also how to domesticate a goat. All that really means is that their current environment can only provide them with stone tools and a goat. If someone gives that same person a machete, I promise you, they'll figure out how to use it pretty quickly. And if it's easier to just take someone else's machete instead of figuring out how to make one for yourself when you don't have access to iron, then you fucking take the machete. Because every living being's goal is to survive. Survival doesn't care about some random person's standards of what is and is not civilized. Survival only cares about what works. You can totally look to real-world cultures to see how people have adapted to specific circumstances in real life. Like, if you're basing the ecology of your setting off of Southeast Asia, it's reasonable to look at the food and architecture of a few different countries to see how they were influenced by the environment. And then you come to the conclusion that yes, people do put coconut milk in everything, but a culture is also going to be influenced by things like religion or whatever history they have of interacting with other cultures. When you tinker with those, obviously things are going to change, and you can't really account for that unless you know what you're doing. So I would advise against whole-ass copying and pasting of cultures. If, at this point, this is sounding like a fucking mess, it's because history and culture have always been messy. Also remember that there's absolutely no reason humans can be different cultures, but other races have to be monolithic. In my own homebrew setting, I did a thing where the orcs to the north of most of the kingdoms herd dire sheep and have a sort of Mad Max flavor about them, and the orcs that live in the desert herd death cows. They're cowboys. Hey, don't look at me like that. The dire sheep and death cows will fuck you up. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's easy to under or overestimate how much power a given fantasy culture might have. If you want that hidden elf city to stay hidden for the sake of your world's lore, they're probably not going to have much sway in politics. No one ever takes small, isolated kingdoms seriously. And if we're going with the canonical regular lore on orcs, I'm sorry, are you telling me that there isn't going to eventually be a charismatic orc chief who unites the different tribes under one banner, and then they go on to take over like half the world? Do I need to remind you what happened the last time we had strong leadership in a nomadic group in real life, and that dude united the other nomad tribes around him, and they did the thing? Do I? Unless your fantasy race is like the Skeksis from the Dark Crystal, or they're just literally the evil half of someone else's soul, there's not really a compelling reason for them to be evil just on their own. Real evil is a lot more mundane and a lot more compelling than the kind of shit you find in poorly written fantasy, and all it takes is just one big bad evil guy. Hopefully, this video gave you some insight onto how societies and people actually work. I wasn't going to get into all the ideas I had, otherwise I'd be here all day, but hopefully this was a good starting point. I want to close this video by saying 3 things. 1, I apologize for the amount of times I mentioned orcs. I'm sorry, I just really love orcs. 2, you don't have to make this a chore. Like, I decided that the areas controlled by dwarves in my setting are also a hot springs resort, so if my players ever make it there, then they have a hot springs episode. You can just have fun with your world building, you just have to let yourself overthink things. 3, don't let yourself be constrained by the lore of a setting if you're using a pre-made campaign world. Unfortunately, this is what happened to an acquaintance of mine on social media where she wanted to be an orc bard, but then the DM was all like, no, orcs are evil, ha ha ha. So she couldn't really play the character she wanted, despite them just being like a people race in another campaign by the same DM. I'm currently a player in a campaign that's nominally Greyhawk, but the DM was just using the map and the Pantheon and everything else was just, fuck it, we'll make it up. I'm also the DM for a Forgotten Realms campaign that made me personally find out that I don't really care about a lot of Forgotten Realms lore. If anyone complains, then fuck them. This is your table's version of the setting. If you followed through all the way to the end, then thanks for watching. I took a while on this one, but I hope to do other videos providing commentary on RPG tropes in the future. If you like what you see, I also talk a lot about other nerdy topics or do dramatic readings, so there's that. You can support me on Patreon or engage with this video however you like. Until next time!